During the winter of 1898 to 1899, 15 souls took part in a pilgrimage to visit Abdul-Bahá, head of the Bahá'í faith, who was then still a prisoner in the Holy Land. This pilgrimage was a pivotal event in the history of the Bahá'í faith, a turning point that would have and continues to have far-reaching implications. Led by their benefactress Phoebe Apperson Hearst, these pilgrims took what they gained from their journey and went on to establish the Bahá'í faith in Europe and re-establish the American Bahá'í community on a rock-solid foundation. Their fascinating story is brilliantly told in Lighting the Western Sky, the first pilgrimage of Western Baha'is to the Holy Land, by Kathryn Jewett Hogenson. It was first published by George Ronald in 2010. More recently, Kathryn has given us Infinite Horizons, the life and times of Horace Holley. It tells the story of a unique man from the next generation of American Baha'is who left an equally indelible imprint on the history of his community for more than 4 decades. Horace Holley was at the center of many transitions in the arts, in war and peace, but most of all in the development of a new religion. I'm Rob Weinberg, and in this episode, Kathryn Jewett Hogenson joins me to talk more about her 2 remarkable books. Welcome to Great Reads, the George Ronald Podcast. Kathy, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Rob.
I want to talk to you today about 2 books. The first is Lighting the Western Sky, which is the story of the Hearst pilgrimage and the establishment of the Baha'i faith in the West, which has been out for a number of years. And the second one is a more recent publication, Infinite Horizons, the life and times of Horace Holley. Perhaps we can start with Lighting the Western Sky, and I have to say that this is one of my very favorite books. It's not often that I would return to a non-fiction book again and again, but this one is so compellingly written, such a good story. Tell us a little bit to begin with about the Hearst pilgrimage and what attracted you to this story.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. I've been very pleased over the years to get letters and emails from people saying, I'm reading it for the 3rd time. So that's very encouraging. But I was serving in Haifa at the Baha'i World Center, and part of my duties included being a pilgrim guide. So I had a special place in my heart for the story about the first Westerners to come, because to me that was part of my story and my spiritual journey to become confirmed through pilgrimage. And I realized that looking at what was available in print, it was a very confusing story about how the first Westerners came, even who they were and their relationships to each other. When I discovered that there were letters and diaries that had not been published, that were sitting in the U.S. Baha'i archives, it just was a wonderful surprise. And I began to explore those and discovered an amazing story of how this little group of primarily young unmarried women found the faith and then came through the largesse of this wealthy, important woman, Phoebe Hearst, to meet with Abdul-Bahá in the winter of 1898, 1899. Some of them really set the world on fire when they left. They were ordinary people who had an extraordinary experience. And the whole story of how the Baha'i faith came out of the Middle East to North America, and from North America then to Europe, although there had been a few Baha'is in Europe as some association because of the German Templars in the Haifa-Akka area. But it was extraordinary. It was mystical. There were miracles that happened. And there were eccentric people. There were love stories involved. There were just amazing events that led to the establishment of the Baha'i faith in the West. And so it was a great privilege to tell that story. And it had so many amazing, wonderful elements of storytelling, everything from the good fairy with her magic checkbook to a villain, someone who really went from being the principal teacher of the Western believers to turning on Abdul-Bahá. So it had many wonderful elements. But it is really the nativity story for the West. And I hope that throughout the ages, people will always appreciate that the faith spread by amazing, mystical, special ways, and that God's hand was so clearly involved in it. And that connection with Abdul-Bahá really makes the Western believers his spiritual children, and he leads us to Baha'u'llah.
Phoebe Hearst was a very wealthy widow. She was a philanthropist. It seems to me, having read your book, that she used to take these trips quite often, didn't she? She would gather groups of friends, and it was part of her self-education in a way that she would take a group of friends off to Europe for the summer or to Egypt or some exotic location and educate herself and the people that she was with in ancient history or religious history or culture. And then sometimes she would buy up the fronts of churches or antiquities and take them back to America. So in 1898, she is making one of these journeys to Egypt. She's gathering her friends and relatives in London and Paris and saying, come along for the ride. But do you think that the people that she was taking with her really knew what they were getting themselves into? Did they have any sense of who Abdul-Bahá was and why she was taking them in particular to this prison city of Akka in order to meet him?
I think that there were varying degrees among those friends. There was one fellow, Orrin Peck. He was part of the group, but he was there in Egypt with him, a longtime family friend of the Hearst. But he chose not to go. He was not interested. There were other people who were desperately interested and begged to be included in the party. And then there were other people who just got caught up in it and thought, oh, yeah, that sounds wonderful. There was a bit of teaching the Baha'i faith to the group that went on in Paris while they were waiting before heading to the Middle East. And part of what they were waiting for was permission to go see Abdul-Bahá. So some of these young people became more enchanted with the idea of going to see this prisoner of conscience, this mystic, this sage. What an adventure for a 21-year-old. This was part of it. But there were others who were not that interested, and their response to the pilgrimage was also very mixed. There was one young woman who, for health reasons, was not allowed to go to Akka, even though she was there at the Grand Hotel in Egypt, but became a Baha'i through some of those who did go, talking to her on the journey back to Paris and to the United States. There were those who, in their heart, never lost their love and admiration for Abdul-Bahá, but didn't really appreciate what they had gotten into. As I said, they were mainly young single women. Several of them got married within the first couple of years after they returned to the U.S. And needless to say, around the period of 1900, a woman was pretty much subject to the wishes of her husband. And if the husband had no interest, unless you had a strong ally like Ella Goodall Cooper did and her mother, Helen, who were a team, Helen helped keep Ella on board when Ella married a man who was not a Baha'i. This was a real issue. And in fact, many of the letters that Abdul-Bahá sent to the people who came, particularly these young women, dealt with the topic of steadfastness. And he knew they were going back to a world where they were not going to encounter other Baha'is very much. They would not have a support group to keep them steadfast. And some of them had the inner strength to be steadfast despite that impediment, and others succumbed to being influenced by those around them who had not had that experience. They didn't even have most of the Baha'i writings in English. They had very little, a couple of prayers. They had some prayer beads. They had memories and notes from talks that were given while they were there. But the fact that with that very tiny knowledge of the faith, some of them like Louis Getzinger, May Maxwell, went on to do amazing things for the faith over the rest of their lifetimes, travel extensively and sacrificially. It really says that the pilgrimage had an amazing effect on some hearts. Everyone's heart's different. Some hearts are more receptive than others. And those particular people, Robert Turner, for example, the first African-American to become a Baha'i, he was absolutely steadfast, even when his employer, Phoebe Hearst, backed off from active participation in the faith. Phoebe apparently was always a believer in her heart, but because of a number of things that happened after she returned to the United States, she backed off from being actively involved in the small Baha'i community of the U.S. at the time. But we know from Abdul-Bahá's own statements after her passing and what was in her bedroom at the time of her passing and so forth, she had Baha'i books by her bedside and so forth, that she always stayed in her heart a believer. She just decided that the Baha'is were too hard to deal with.
They were very courageous, weren't they? Because Abdul-Bahá was a prisoner still. They had to stay in Haifa and go across in the dead of night in groups of 2s and 3s and so on. They must have been very courageous and very brave, and they must have had tremendous sense of adventure as well, in a sense, to put themselves through that.
I think that most of them, because they were young people, it was a sense of adventure. Phoebe Hearst is a middle-aged woman whose husband was a politician, and she had spent years in Washington, D.C. and dealing with high-up government officials, and her son was William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper man. She understood the danger both to Abdul-Bahá and to herself and her family's position in society being associated with what would seem as a very strange religious cult or sect. And I think when word got back to Constantinople that Phoebe had been there, the government sent an order to shut it down. There was a delay, of course. She was long gone by the time that order got there, but there were still other Westerners coming. And then around March of 1899, has to send the last of them away and tell them, we're under government scrutiny now, so stop. And it was putting him in jeopardy as well as the people who'd come to see him. I think that they knew that there was a problem. And I think that, as I said, if you're a young person in your 20s, that just adds to the fun. Anyway, I'm not sure exactly how they all felt about that. They knew it. But I think this was the problem that happened when they got back. It is some of the more impulsive of the young members of that group didn't understand what a precarious position Phoebe was in. And I think that was part of why she backed away from active participation, because her son was trying to run for president, trying to get the Democratic Party nomination for that. He'd already served in Congress. And she knew that his enemies would use her association with the Baha'i faith against her son politically. Abdul-Bahá was probably very aware of that as well. And my own personal opinion is that there probably is correspondence still in the Hearst family possession and in the possession of the World Center that was done through a third party who worked for Phoebe, Ali Kuli Khan, a young Persian who worked for her for years. And I think he was probably her correspondent. And I think that there was an understanding between her and Abdul-Bahá that their relationship had to be kept quiet and careful, because he could also get in great trouble. The Sultan of Turkey, under whose control he was and who had put him under house arrest yet again, knew that Phoebe had the political connections in Washington to cause him problems. And they both had danger in that relationship.
What's really wonderful about this book is the way you tell the story. And it's one thing to have access to letters and diaries and archives. It's another to really weave together a narrative that takes the reader along with you and excites them and gives them the same sense of anticipation that the people themselves in the story are experiencing. Your background isn't in writing, is it?
I'm a lawyer. Although lawyers, we tell stories all the time. You're telling a story to a jury or to a judge or in an appellate brief. You're trying to give a narrative. And I think also what prepared me was reading many children's books to my children over the years. And then as a pilgrim guide, I was also trying to not just impart facts, but to create an atmosphere and tell a story, tell a narrative. And this is how human beings have always functioned. And it was, to me, a great privilege to be able to tell that story. I was doing it in the Holy Land, so I knew what spring was like, what flowers are out, and how to describe what they would have seen. I spent a great deal of time with my husband exploring Israel during the 18 years we were there. And I was able to have access to some of the holy places in ways that normal people serving at the World Center don't have access, because I was a pilgrim guide. And also because I often helped with special events that put me into back rooms at those places. And I was able to talk to other staff about this, and they would provide insights that I wouldn't have thought of. One of the custodians was the one that gave me the insight that if you go to the mansion at Bahá'í and you see the room where Shoghi Effendi has placed 3 photographs, Anton Haddad, Thornton Chase, and Phoebe Hearst, they're lined up. I had never thought about why those 3 people were there. Anton Haddad, of course, is the person who first brought the faith to North America, actually to the Western Hemisphere, as far as we know. Thornton Chase is considered the first American believer, and Phoebe Hearst is the one who made the establishment of the faith solid and successful. Had she not taken that group to the Holy Land, the earlier efforts to establish the faith probably would have come to nothing. So she's the one that made the firm connection with Abdul-Bahá that put the Western Baha'i communities on solid ground. And the Guardian recognized that by placing her photograph with those other 2 there in the mansion at Bahá'í.
So you spent many years working on lighting the western sky, and then you turn your attention to another very distinguished, prominent figure in the history of the faith, particularly in North America, Horace Holley. What attracted you to the character of Horace Holley?
Before I ever served in Haifa, for several years, I worked in a subdivision of the Secretariat of the U.S. National Assembly. And I used to see letters from Horace Holley in the early 1980s. It wasn't that long since he had been secretary, and so they showed up in people's files and so forth. There were people alive and still serving there who had served during his time, so I heard a little bit about him that way. When I was completing Lighting the Western Sky, the good friends at George Ronald were urging me to start immediately on another book. And I knew from one of the most prominent Baha'i scholars, Horace Kazemzadeh, he had said that a good general history of the faith could not be written until we had enough biographies of key people. And so I realized that most of the hands of the cause still lacked biographies. And I sent a list to the archivist at the U.S. National Archives and said, do you have people who are already working on books on any of these people? And Horace was one that he said was not being worked on at the time. Actually, I later found out that there was one person who was working on it or had tried to work on it, and she became a friend and shared some of her research. But as an attorney, I'm also interested in organization, a political science major from university and then a law school degree, and have worked in government. And so I'm very interested in how systems work. I have worked in the Baha'i Administrative Order. I did the first draft of Guidelines for Local Spiritual Assemblies that is used as the manual in the United States. And so Horace was a natural for me. And then on a personal level, his middle name is Hodgkin, which is the maiden name of my great-grandmother. And I did find that we have a mutual Puritan ancestor who was one of the founders of New Haven, Connecticut. This seemed to be, for me, a good fit. And he was a much greater challenge than Lighting the Western Sky. Lighting the Western Sky had a natural flow as a story. But Horace lived in his head. He was a poet, a writer, a deep thinker. He was a very quiet person, which when I realized that was a bit of a surprise because he wrote so much that I felt like I was hearing him all the time. But I realized he used his pen, not his mouth. He would sit in a room and be very quiet during a meeting. So trying to take this person whose life is in their head and create a story was a much greater challenge. And I realized that there are several threads of stories that ran through Horace's life. One of the most important was his own spiritual development, because he didn't start off as an angelic person. And then there is the story of the development of the American Baha'i community and the administrative order, which he was very key part in that. So with those two stories running in tandem, it was really fascinating for me because, as you will notice, the subtitle is The Life and Times of Horace Holley, because Horace lived in his head, but he was very much a man in the world. He loved being in big cities. He lived in Paris and Florence and Siena, Italy, but he spent much of his life, maybe the majority of it, in New York City. And he loved being in the center of things. He was a huge newspaper and politics junkie, very interested in world affairs, which is something that has always fascinated me. And he was very interested in how he could use his pen to move society. His essays in particular, even though he wrote and published many poems, I find his essays to be much more interesting and, in fact, better. He was writing for major journals at the time, like New Republic, as well as getting his poetry published in major magazines like Poetry Magazine and a lot of the avant-garde little magazines and in anthologies. He was a very interesting challenge. You can see his spiritual development because he writes about it. And most people don't leave that kind of a record. So to see how he went from being a frat boy from New England who liked to smoke and play cards to being a spiritual giant who was absolutely physically luminous his last years because of inner light that shone through him is really an amazing story, as well as the story of how the Baha'i faith continued to develop from World War I up until 1960.
Yes, I think you did that extremely well, because my perception of Horace Holley was that he had spent decades as an administrator and probably spent most of his life in meetings and writing reports and writing minutes and so forth. But to keep that story compelling took quite some skill, I think. But I wanted to ask you, because you mentioned his early years, and he's a very interesting character. He's quite bohemian, isn't he, originally? He's running an art gallery in Paris. He's
Right.
mixing with all these characters who are at the sort of cutting edge of the avant-garde in the early part of the 20th century. What was the source of his transformation? When he first encounters Abdul-Bahá, he's quite nervous about actually approaching him, isn't he?
He has a mystical experience as he's crossing the lawn. And he wasn't someone subject to mystical experiences. But as he sees Abdul-Bahá for the first time, something happens on the inside. But even before that, what's interesting, when he was at Williams College and was very involved with the literary magazine there, which was a big deal in the early 20th century to be involved in publications like that at a prominent school, one of the other students reviewing his poems in the Williams College newspaper said the problem with his poems was that they were too religious. For some reason, even when he was a young man, even in high school, a lot of his poetry that he writes when he's away at a boarding school, it still has a religious bent to it. So he's clearly thinking about things in a way that's different. And I think that part of that is because when he was still a child, he experienced great loss with the loss of his father. And that was a slow-moving tragedy because his father was mentally ill and then died in an insane asylum. And he was put in the asylum when he was around 4 or 5 and then died when Horace was about 12. And so the family is dealing with this tremendous loss of the father. And then he loses his mother at a fairly young age while he's still in university, and he'd been very close to his mother. So these losses, I think, are part of what spurred him to think deeply about religion. His family had been very active in the Congregational Church. His grandfather had helped to fund the building of the main Congregational Church in his hometown of Torrington, Connecticut. The Congregationalists were the descendants of the Puritans. His family had very deep roots in New England Puritan culture. He was very proud of that and very much aware of those early Christian thinking of those who braved the Atlantic to get away from the persecution they were experiencing under Charles I or under the Stuarts. He had this in his background, and he was very close to his youngest brother, the one that's next in age to him, Irving. Irving was also very religious. And at the time that they encounter Bertha Herbert on board ship, where he gets the Baha'i book about Abdul-Bahá and is introduced to the faith, his brother's with him, and his brother is very religious. I think that this was something that was part of his makeup. But he also went through the youthful experiences of hanging out in Greenwich Village, New York with Bertha and in Paris and later, and also just college fraternity life, all of those kinds of things that set him on other paths. He was always interested in literature and art and music. He was less interested in music the older he got, but when he was young, he liked to be in choirs. He even directed an opera at one point when he was young. So he had a great deal of interest in the arts, but the older he got, the more practical he got. Life hit him over the head. He had children to support, and he didn't have the inheritance to live without working. So he had to become a little bit more practical. And it's interesting, there's a wonderful letter he writes to another Baha'i who was a professional architect. And this architect was quite upset that his design had not been chosen for the house of worship for the Chicago area, for North America. And Horace writes this very poignant, wonderful letter about when you're an artistic sort of person, as they both were, how you feel like this is how you want to serve the faith, and you have these inner yearnings to use your art, your poetry, your ability to write, or in the case of the architect, to draw and to create an amazing building. But that may not be what the faith needs. And so he had to learn to put aside what he wanted in life and do what was needed. And that wasn't easy. There were many times he had to be reminded, even during his period as Secretary of the National Assembly, that no, we know you want to do this, Horace, but no, this is not what the faith needs right now. And this is part of what this grinding away at these sharp edges and this submission to the will of God is part of what made him the spiritual giant he became. And we all have to do that. And it's a good example, a positive example of someone who did that during his life and came out at the end a very happy, amazing person who did have a great impact on the world, even though much of that impact will be seen in the future. It wasn't seen as much during his lifetime.
When you write a book like Lighting the Western Sky or Infinite Horizons about Horace Holley, you really have to love your subject because you're going to be spending years with these people. I just wondered if, from all the characters that you've come across in your writing of history, is there someone that you really would have loved to have met or you feel particularly close to?
Phoebe Hearst is very close to a perfect person in many ways. She liked to be in control, and that would be her primary defect. And I think had she come along 100 years later, where she would have had more opportunities in life as a woman, she would have probably been an outstanding academic and certainly a very fascinating person. But there's so many people that are wonderful that I would have loved to have spent time with. Obviously, Horace would have been fascinating. He would have been a great dinner companion. But there are some who would have been more fun. The book that my husband and I helped to co-write that came out from the Publishing Trust on Roy Wilhelm. Roy was certainly a more lively person and fun person to spend time with, even though he and Horace were good buddies, and they both had odd senses of humor, so I'm sure that together they were fun. But I think Ella Goodall Cooper would have been a very interesting, lovely lady to spend time with. One of my great regrets is that when I was a young Baha'i living in the Chicago area working for the National Assembly, one of the friendships I made was with Edna True, who was in her 90s. Edna knew everybody I ever wrote about, but she also knew Abdul-Bahá. So when I was with Edna, she would want to tell me about, I knew the greatest holy leaf, and I was, oh, wonderful. Could you tell me more about Abdul-Bahá? I used to play tennis with Shoghi Effendi. Oh, wonderful. Could you tell me more about Abdul-Bahá? Horace Holley used to come to my house all the time. Oh, that's great. Just tell me more about Abdul-Bahá. Every single person, Louis Getzing, Robert Turner, all these people would have been people that Edna knew. And what was the sound of their voice? What were they like? Did they fidget? How was it sitting there at table with them? All of these kinds of things. And I was in my 20s. I didn't fully appreciate the life she had lived and the amazing people she had gotten to know. And of course, I didn't ask those questions. So there's tremendous regret, but we can't know everything about all these people. And it's why we need to record the people who are alive now who still have amazing memories and to ask them about the side players. This is one of the other things. There are all these amazing side players in these lives that we need to be talking about. For example, Horace's wife, Doris, she was integral to his work in the faith. And we know a lot less about her than we do about him. And there are still people alive, particularly in the Irish community, who remember her very well. We need to get those memories put down on paper so we don't forget. There always are these helpers, these other people in the room, and I wish I knew more about them. One of the ones who, of course, we all wish we knew better was Robert Turner. And because he was a butler by profession, he didn't leave a great paper trail. And attempts even shortly after he passed away to follow the trail was not so easy. We'll just have to accept that lovely man. We'll just never know much about him.
But it also makes the point that we have to have biographies and we have to tell these stories for future generations to draw inspiration from. And you've done that, certainly, with your 2 books for George Ronald, Infinite Horizons, The Life and Times of Horace Holley, and Lighting the Western Sky, The Hearst Pilgrimage and the Establishment of the Baha'i Faith in the West. Thank you so much, Kathy, for joining us and telling us about your books.
Thank you so much, Rob. All the best.
My thanks to Kathryn Jewett Hogenson. Both Lighting the Western Sky and Infinite Horizons are available in print and as electronic publications from grbooks.com and from your National Baha'i Publishing Trust or distribution service. We'll be back again soon with more great reads, the George Ronald Podcast.